Oh, it's okay.
Henry, we're expecting you to come through here.
Well, that comes later.
All right.
Hi. Is it Tango, yes?
Oh no, that's in the MA group.
I was looking at the person closest to the person I was speaking to last night, and it was you. But it wasn't you I was speaking to last night.
Well, you are.
Yes, but not about the tango.
No.
Okay. What's her name?
Tabitha.
Tabitha, that's right, yes. Right.
Oh no, I think it was Angela actually.
What? They'll be out for coffee later.
You know, I'm going there now because I've got to teach them in a minute, so I can take that.
It's about this new thing in Norwich.
Okay, great.
Yeah. Just say who's the girl from Norwich.
Right.
And that's her.
Oh, it's not Tabitha.
That's Angela.
Yeah.
Angela, thank you. Angela then.
Yeah.
If I wrote the name Angela on, she would actually think I remembered her name, wouldn't she?
Yeah.
God. Right. Are you off then this morning, Philip?
Yeah, I'm afraid I'm going to the economics.
Actually, I think I'll come with you.
Yeah?
It sounds quite interesting, yes. I think I'll come with you.
I tell you, yours will be much better.
Oh, I don't know about that. Yeah. My chest isn't brilliant today. It's after travel yesterday.
All right.
And the weather, of course.
It should be open up this afternoon.
Good. There'll be a lot of coffee this morning. I've got some stuff which I'll go. You can't get anything from me. You don't have to worry.
Sorry, I've given everything.
Yeah, because I don't have a cold or anything like that. It's much worse than that. And the thing is that it's not contagious. It's just deadly.
So shall I introduce you then?
No.
No?
No.
You don't want to introduce me?
No.
Well,
Hello, everybody.
You don't want me to tell you how every time you come here, you change somehow how I'm looking at the world.
No.
Okay, I won't do that.
No, don't do that.
Right.
No, it's all right. We just...
Start.
Well, we, yeah, that's the problem, isn't it? What? Well, you see, not doing very well, am I? You see, that's always the problem, where to begin. So we have to begin, but where to begin? That's the problem. In fact...
No, I'm going to begin by ending.
Brilliant idea. Can you trust me?
Henry, absolutely.
You can?
Yeah.
Don't want to leave me on my own?
No, you always begin and then suddenly you're in the flow and it's fine.
Yes, okay. Right, off we go.
Yeah.
If I get stuck, I can't get you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just call somebody to come and get me.
I'll do that,
Right.
yeah. So that really, this musing on the beginning is really what the whole week is going to be about. It's about where to begin. And at the end of the week, you'll realise just what a concrete statement that is, because that's what it's all about, where to begin. But right now, it's back to the beginning in the ordinary sense of the term. Where to begin here this morning, it's always a problem. And I always think of Nietzsche, the philosopher I don't like. The one thing it said was that beginnings are expensive. They take a lot of energy, and that by the time you've actually got your beginning, you're halfway there already, which I certainly have always found to be true. Myself, though, I prefer the Mullah Nasruddin to Nietzsche, and the Mullah Nasruddin, you know his story, that he decided he wanted to learn to play the piano. So he went to a piano teacher, and he asked him how much lessons cost. And the piano teacher said, the first lesson is 15 dirhams. It's got to be dirhams, because this is a Middle Eastern story, and everything was always dirhams. So there you are. If first lesson is 15 dirhams, and after that it's 10 dirhams a lesson. Excellent, said the mullah. I'll start with the second lesson. And that seems to me to be very good advice. That's actually what I'm going to do. I'm going to start with the second lesson, and that gets rid of my problem at the beginning. But there are just a couple of things I would like to mention from the first lesson. if I was going to give it. Firstly, I want to say wholeness is everywhere. I like to say that wholeness is ubiquitous. I like to say that because I like using the word ubiquitous. And you can't get many opportunities in life for saying ubiquitous, so here's my chance, I've done it now. It's a word which needs, I think, to be used more. We tend to think of wholeness as something special, something extraordinary, something that is only under certain circumstances, something that we perhaps have to work for, have to achieve, or whatever, I don't know. But it's special. But in fact, it's everywhere, because our own immediate experience is intrinsically holistic. It's what in phenomenology is called lived experience. And what that means is experience as it is actually being lived, which is quite different from lived experience, which is experience that has been lived. And we overlook this, and we overlook it because we overlook it, and we think actually in terms of lived experience, experience that has been lived, instead of experience as it is lived. This is really one of the great discoveries of 20th century philosophy, the discovery of lived experience. And it's brought about a transformation in understanding, and it goes right back to the beginning of the 19th century. No, I mean the beginning of the 20th century, though there are elements at the beginning of the 19th. It's very funny. Well, it's not funny. But everybody knows the 20th century in terms of revolutions in science, revolutions in physics. They go on and on endlessly about revolutions. They don't ever stop to think about what a revolution would mean, but never mind. They talk about the quantum revolution, heavens only knows what. But what nobody notices is that there was, at precisely the same time, going exactly in parallel time-wise, a total revolution in Western philosophy, with the onset, with the development of phenomenology, beginning with Husserl and so on and that, which radically transformed the way we understand our ordinary everyday experience and who we are. It's quite extraordinary, and showed that experience is intrinsically holistic. And this then follows right the way through. I'm not going to be dealing with this directly, but this follows right the way through. And I always find it rather fascinating, or rather horrifying, that people, almost invariably, people who don't know anything about quantum mechanics, go banging on endlessly about wholeness in quantum mechanics. Physicists, incidentally, never do. But non-physicists go on about it endlessly. Whereas, in fact, it's a red herring. Because the real discovery, the important wholeness that was discovered, was the wholeness of lived experience itself. And that's a remarkable thing, which people who think they can learn about wholeness from quantum physics and so on are missing the real point. Do you know what a red herring is?
Yes.
You do, it's a kipper. And you know why it's called that? This is the first detour of many. It's because they used to do this. They could do this today with fox hunting. You know, there's always a problem about fox hunting, that people don't like it, people do like it. But what hunt saboteurs did in the old days, they, much more subtle than now, where they just get angry. They used to take a red herring, which is a kipper, and you tie it on a piece of string, and when the fox has gone through, you drag the kipper across and off over there. And when the dogs come, they follow the red herring. They follow the kipper and not the fox. Today's hunt saboteurs don't seem to have the intelligence to do that. And instead, they're like argy-bargy fighting and getting the police out and so on and that. I think it's a shame, don't you? But I think quantum mechanics is a red herring. I think we're on the way to discovering the wholeness of lived experience. This had been done, and then whoops, here comes the red herring of quantum mechanics. Oh, we must understand wholeness in quantum physics first. I met so many people travelling around who seem to think that. So anyway, and I mentioned this because I was involved donkeys years ago in work on foundations of quantum physics, and so people often expect me to be to be concerned with that. I'm not. I've told you what I think about it, but it's a shame that this remarkable philosophical revolution has still not got through to people. Well, perhaps it's always the case. There are signs, you see, that it is gradually. I was at it's only 100 years. Only 100 years. Things do take time, don't they? I was at a conference in Oxford. Oh God, I don't know when was it? End of July, and there were 240 people there. 239 of whom were psychologists, sociologists, social workers, therapists of every kind of persuasion you've got, and one physicist. That was me. And I was down there to give a talk on one particular day. I couldn't afford to go any other day. But what was very striking was how much this work from phenomenological thinking of lived experience has now infiltrated into the work of therapists of all kinds of persuasions and so on. So it's not quite as bleak a picture as I sort of thought it was. Things are gradually moving. New ideas discovered 100 years ago are actually beginning to infiltrate into the way in which people think. And perhaps that's how it always is. Anyway, I think that's important. Now, the thing is, so what I was saying after that detour is that my red herring is that lived experience itself is intrinsically holistic, and therefore it's everywhere, it's ubiquitous. So we overlook this, and we do so because we overlook it, and we can't help it. We can't help overlooking it. It's a consequence of the dynamics of experience itself. This will come out in other ways of the week, or what you could call the dynamics of consciousness itself. In 20th century European philosophy, the term consciousness is not used very much because of associations. It's found to be an unhelpful term. When we talk about lived experience, or I'll talk about this a little bit more later, it seems strange to a lot of people, but the term just drops out. It turns out to be unnecessary. Once you start describing lived experience, you find you don't actually need to use the word consciousness. And it has all sorts of connotations and associations historically, which bring in all sorts of things which really are very confusing. So, because we overlook it and can't help it, we go looking for wholeness where it isn't to be found. And that brings me to, of course, my favourite philosopher, the Mullah Nasruddin again. There's the story of the Mullah Nasruddin that it was dark and he was under a street light and he was looking around on the ground. And a policeman came along who knew him and said, "Hello, Mullah, you look like you've lost something." "Yes," he said, "I've lost my ring." "Oh," he said, "policeman, I'll help you find it." And so he looked around with the Mullah for a bit. And he said, "I can't see a ring here anywhere. Are you sure you lost it here?" I said, "Oh no, I lost it over there in the dark, but there's more light here." And that's what we're like. It's a lovely picture of what we're like. Aristotle, second philosopher, mentioned today. Aristotle, this is supposed to be a philosophy module, you see. I've got to keep mentioning philosophers. Mention Nietzsche, whom I don't like. Aristotle, whom I do like. Right? Aristotle said we're like bats, blinded by the light of the day. So blinded by the light of the day, we can't see what is immediately in front of us. And that's what we're like. So we're blinded by the light of consciousness, we can't see what is immediately in front of us. Now, that's the first thing I wanted to mention from the first lesson, which I'm not giving. The second thing I wanted to mention from the first lesson is that in spite of what I've just said about it, wholeness isn't fundamental. It's a natural consequence of what comes before wholeness. Hegel would say, third philosopher mentioned, name dropping this morning, make sure I earn my money, philosophy module, got the best philosophy. Hegel would have said it's a consequence, it's a logical consequence, but that's L with logical with a capital L, it doesn't mean what we mean by logic. It's actually the structure of the being itself. We'll say it's a natural consequence of what comes before wholeness. And that is the dynamics of being. And that's why when we try to begin with wholeness, we seem to get somewhere at first, and then it all goes wrong. We've seen this time and again. We have to begin before wholeness with the dynamics of being, because wholeness is a natural consequence of that dynamics. And it took me a very long time to realise this, because for many years I was involved with, obviously one form or another, some things to do with wholeness. But I did gradually realise, and for the last 10 years or more, I've been working on the dynamics of being. And this is where I'm going to begin. This is now the second lesson, okay? I've written a book. It's called The Dynamics of Being. And subtitle will be something I'd like to call it Phenomenological and Goethean Studies. But I'm told no publisher would accept a title as boring as that. I like it, actually. It's dull, isn't it? As far as I'm concerned, dull is good. But other people don't think so. They want something exciting. But every exciting title I've thought of is misleading. And it is a series of studies, or can be seen as that, which is a bit about it's phenomenological and it's Goethean in bits and pieces here and there, and it's all mixed in together. So why not call it Phenomenological and Goethean Studies? Do you find that terribly dull? Yes. No. Yes. It's a failure, isn't it, obviously? Yes. You love it? Did you say you love it?
Yeah, I buy it.
Wow. Thank you, sir. Right, that's it. Okay. Anyway, the dynamics of being. And to begin with, it starts off with... I'm going to read some bits of it. I've done this before, so you don't have to worry. And the only reason I do it again is because people seem to like it, which is nice. There's a quotation at the beginning from Henri Bergson, who's in French, of course, Henri Bergson, but here we call him Henri Bergson. And I'll read it in very bad French. Philosophie consiste à invertir la direction habituelle du travail de la pensée, which it doesn't translate terribly well into English, because philosophie is to, in English, it's a verb, so it would be to philosophize. Now, that's the worst thing you can do, as far as English is concerned, and quite right, is to go about philosophizing. So it doesn't mean that. What it really means is that, as he puts it, philosophy consists in inverting the habitual direction of the work of thought. So he's saying thinking has a habitual direction, and philosophy is a kind of work which inverts the habitual direction of thought. And that seems to me to be a very good account, because it introduces, for me, this important idea of philosophical work, doing philosophical work. And that's what I try to do. And it's not the same thing as doing philosophy. There are many, many, many philosophy books which have got no philosophical work in them at all. And it is perfectly possible to do philosophical work without knowing much about philosophy. Wittgenstein was a prime example, although he probably knew much more than he let on. If you focus on philosophical work, what you tend to do is to pick up various aspects of philosophy on the way, and you get a deeper sense of what different philosophers are talking about, because you're actively working philosophically, which is different from going to a book which will say, oh, Descartes said this, and Kant said that, and so on and that. If you find you come to these things through actual working, they become much more meaningful in that way. So what I'm interested in is doing philosophical work. And you'll understand as we go on what this means. And it is inverting the habitual direction of thought. So I quite like that statement of Bergson's. And now I'm going to read the first bit from the preface. which tells you what I'm really trying to do. And then this is a book. It isn't long. This is a book about a different way of thinking. The dynamic way of thinking, which is the general name I'm going to give it, first appears in European thought at the beginning of the 19th century in the... can't read my writing. I've just changed it all, you see. Well, at the beginning of the 19th century, it begins there, you find it with Goethe and the so-called Romantic movement, and also in that same movement of philosophy at that time, which is misleadingly referred to as German idealism. It always gives it a capital I, German, and a capital G, of course. German idealism. It's a very misleading term. And this all happened round about the same time in round about the same place. And that basically was a very remarkable period of time. It was place. Sorry, it's passed my mind. Round Jena, a remarkable group of people there focused around Goethe in a very loose kind of way. Goethe, I have some difficulty talking about because I've just used the word romantic, and so many people know or believe they know that Goethe has often been referred to as the father, well, he was male, so he'd have to be, wouldn't he? The father of Romanticism, German Romanticism. Now, I think this is completely untrue. And I actually think that Goethe was the very opposite. And it's very interesting, Goethe himself said that nobody had ever understood him at all, and he doubted it was possible for any one person to ever understand another person. And he said, all the views people have of me have nothing whatsoever to do with me at all. I find Goethe to be a very plain, straightforward, very commonsensical, down-to-earth man. He was, to me, the very opposite of romantic, because the romantics actually believe that you can discover the truth by going into yourself and finding truth. And this certainly happened at that time. Now, he says that that's really the wrong thing to do. You find out who you are by going into the world. What he actually says is the opposite of romanticism. But of course, he wrote novels like the thing about Werther and so on and that. It happens today all the time. People identify a novelist with what he writes. Now, actually, what Goethe's saying in Werther is, look, don't be such a plonker as this. You don't do this kind of thing. This is not the way to go about living. But everyone said, oh, this is the romantic thing that Goethe's expressing. This is romanticism. What he's actually saying is, don't do that. It's not a successful way to live. And of course, he uses, as all writers do, elements from his own life experience, which he then transforms into art. People don't understand this. They think actually, today, I've heard writers complaining about this all the time, right now, because it is, people aren't interested in books, they're interested in people who wrote the books now. So they have literary festivals where you can go and... About the most dangerous thing that happened to a modern writer is to have an unfortunate incident at a literary festival. That's about the extent of their lives today. Everyone thinks that what's in the book is simply autobiographical, and it isn't. So they misunderstood Goethe here. He drew on experience, but he wasn't recommending that experience. In fact, I might as well clear this up now. I actually have a belief that Goethe was so much the opposite of romantic. This father of romanticism was so much the opposite of romantic. He's actually the antidote to romanticism. And I think of course, he lived there among all the romantics and was part of them. Well, I think it's the same thing. You find dock leaves in the middle of stinging nettles. Well, I think that Goethe is the dock leaf to the sting of romanticism. And this view is completely heretical, and there will be people coming here later who, if you mention this to them, will actually have a paroxysm and a fit and God knows what. But there you are. There is one book on Goethe I've really liked. I haven't read a lot. It's by John Armstrong, it's interesting. People who've read this book didn't know about Goethe, thought it was really... Anyway, never mind that. John Armstrong, and it's called Love, Life, Goethe, How to be Happy in an Imperfect World. And it just, to me, it shows Goethe as a kind of man who developed a higher kind of common sense. So that's my view on Goethe. And I have to tell this because I've just said this stuff here about this dynamic way of thinking. First appears in European thought at the beginning of the 19th century in the Romantic movement with Goethe and the philosophy of German idealism, as it's sometimes referred to very misleadingly, because that philosophy itself developed in Jena. See, Goethe lived in Weimar, which is 18 miles or so from Jena, but the whole thing was, Germany at this time, 1800, was a patchwork, about 300 tiny statelets and principalities, duchies, dukedoms, heavens knows what. It was entirely different from the Germany we think of as Germany, what Germany became because of the dominance of Prussia and all sorts of things. Germany, as it became, was completely different from Germany as was 100 years before. It's astonishing. There's no wonder they had so much trouble and caused so much trouble. The transformation was extraordinary. Anyway, he worked for the Duke, and he was pretty much the kind of... he had to do more or less what the Duke wanted. And Goethe turned out to have tremendous ability in administration. He was very, very good at organising things and people. So his job was basically to administer the duchy. And he was in charge of the mines, he was in charge of the forestry, he was in charge of the theatre, he was privy councillor, he was in charge of all sorts of things. He was a very practical man. Oh, and then he also wrote some poetry and plays and so on and all that business. But and he was also responsible for the recruitment and so on and that to the university at Jena, which was a smallish university, but over a period of 10 years was transformed into a place which is now spoken of historically as, my God, what explosion happened at Jena. It went from 10 years, it went from nothing to being really something on the map. And he got various philosophers in. He got Fichte in, and then Fichte left under a cloud later. Then he got Schelling. Now Schelling was the wunderkind. He was about 21, 22, 23. And he was the man who did the Naturphilosophy, the philosophy of nature. And also Hegel was there. I got a street map of Jena at that time with the houses where they all lived. There was Fichte, there was Schelling, there was Hegel. There's the three big names of German idealism. They're all living more or less in the same streets next to one another in Jena for that short period of time. Schleiermacher, the great theologian, was there. And of course the people who were called the German Romantics, the Schlegels and various other Schlegel brothers and the femme fatale. These groups always have a femme fatale at this time, who was Caroline Böhmer, Schlegel, Schelling, she finally became. As she went from man to man, she accumulated a longer name. And so on. And Goethe was right in the middle of this. But he was actually 10 years older than the rest of them. And they always found him rather aloof. He spent a lot of time with the young Schelling. Well, he was aloof because he didn't feel at home. Because in many ways he sympathised with what they were doing, but he also wasn't completely at home with the way they were, and with that attitude of truth is to be found by going within yourself, which was new at the time. You find in the deeper recesses of yourself. The truth of the world out there is to be found in the deeper recesses of yourself. Go inward, young man, and find yourself and discover a whole world there, and all of that. Well, he thought this was wrong. You actually find out who you are by the way you are in the world, and it's very subtle. It's as if the world reflects who you are to yourself. So you learn in a very subtle way from the world. It's showing you who you are. And you develop that way. This is not a romantic attitude. This is a higher kind of common sense. So when I talk about Goethe, because I've done a lot on Goethe, people expect me to be like they are and to think what they think. And I actually pretty much think the opposite about Goethe. Great respect for him, but not for the reasons people would expect me to have. So I've said that now, because later on I'll be talking about Goethe some more, and I might as well get that off my chest now. It's very remarkable how all that stuff developed there, and then it all went, of course. So that's... I wasn't intending to say that this morning, but I sort of feel what sometimes comes upon me, a certain amount of background filling in needs to be done. Okay, so that's where this dynamic way of thinking first really appears, and then it sort of subsides a bit after 1840. Going back to that. Here, as always, this is important, but here, as always, it takes a form that is specific to the particular circumstances in which it appears. Confusing the container with the content, as we so often do, means that inevitably we end up focusing too much attention on the specific form which this way of thinking takes in the particular instance, and consequently fail to see the more universal content, which is the movement of thinking itself. We get identified with what everybody said, and we spend ages being academic and intellectual about all of that. And what we don't notice is the movement of thinking itself, for which everything that they said was merely a container. We think what the thing they said was the content. It's not the content. It's the container for the movement of thinking. It's like, to go to the radio wave analogy, it's the radio wave doesn't matter. What you want is the audio wave. You want to listen to the radio. But the radio wave carries the audio wave. No, I don't like that today. No, I'll leave that one. The dynamic way of thinking, it sort of fades out after 1840, and then it comes up again. The dynamic way of thinking appears again in European philosophy in the first part of the 20th century, in the philosophy of phenomenology and hermeneutics. I will also mention that there is another whole stream which is different from this, where it also occurs, which is the stream which starts with Bergson, which is very similar to phenomenology at first, and then it develops in a more vitalistic way later on with the sort of neo-vitalism of Gilles Deleuze after the 1950s, 1960s and so on. And of course, anyone here heard of Deleuze? No, what a pity. Never mind. He is very important, very famous French philosopher. Don't worry about it. Most people have no idea what's been going on in philosophy at all. So I have to remind myself of that fact when I'm talking to people. Because to me, you think to yourself, God, how can anyone know I'm not mad? I'll tell you what. But then you go. It's goldfish bowls. It's goldfish bowls. We're all in goldfish bowls. I'm actually in a different goldfish bowl to you, which is why I always find coming to Schumacher very awkward. Because all the things you know and you're interested in, I'm not in that at all. And you'll think I am, and I'm not. And I'm in another goldfish bowl, and I have to remember that. And this is how it works. We're all swimming in different goldfish bowls. And sadly, I'm not in your... Well, I'm quite happy. Not sadly. I'm not in your goldfish bowl, and you're not in mine. So I have to remember that when talking to you. There's nothing... What I'm saying goldfish bowls because it's not important. It's just... You're in the world you're in. And that's that. So you're not in another world. You don't know about what's in that world. It's amazing, the things that you come across. Oh, never mind. Anyway, forget it. Right, so it appears again, phenomenology and hermeneutics, apart from also this other stream from Bergson on, which is called neo-vitalism. Remarkable parallels. But once again, We are too easily seduced by the specifics of the occasion to notice the more universal element. But divergent as these philosophical movements may seem outwardly, and they are divergent, they nevertheless belong together when they are seen in terms of the movement of thinking which each expresses in its own different way. The significance of this dynamic way of understanding easily gets lost in the obfuscations of philosophers who, in their endless attempts to justify what they are doing, all too often succeed only in covering it over with a dense layer of what to others seems to be just impenetrable jargon. The vision gets lost, and what is left descends into an intellectual exercise, which turns round upon itself endlessly until it ceases to be of interest to any but a few. This is such a pity, because there is something here which is potentially of much wider interest and which needs to be brought out. I said there the vision gets lost, and it is a kind of vision, not in the visionary sense. It is a whole way of seeing, a whole way of experiencing. And it's not, you can say that the background to this, the framework is intellectual, but actually what it comes to is an experience of a way of seeing. And this is fundamental. And this is what I latched onto in 1970, 1971. And I realised this. And I was very lucky in 1986. There's a very famous German philosopher you won't have heard of. His name is Hans-Georg Gadamer. He was a pupil of Heidegger's. You must have heard of Heidegger, for God's sake. And Gadamer died in 2002 at the age of 102. And I met him when he was 86. I've been studying his work since 1970. I met him in 1986. And he was an extraordinary man. And he was at a conference in Oxford and then immediately to a conference in London. And I was at both of them. And he was an incredible... And he was always there. Mostly these famous professors, and he was really famous, they turn up for the talk before theirs, give theirs, stay for the talk after and vanish. He was there for every single thing in both conferences. And the comments he offered to people were amazing. He was actually a living manifestation of his own philosophy. You don't meet many people like that. And he said that phenomenology is a way of seeing. It's like, and that has to be developed. And he said, with phenomenology, it's a way of making things appear. And Husserl used to say to his students, not arguments, gentlemen, not arguments, seeing. And the whole thing from the beginning has been concerned with developing a way of seeing. And that's why I say the vision gets lost and it degenerates. When I say vision, I do mean vision, but I don't mean it in a visionary religious sense, or I don't mean anything spiritual by it. It's actually philosophical. There is a kind of philosophical work which actually develops a new way of seeing. And this doesn't happen because people don't even know that it exists. That possibility, which is rather a shame. It's what philosophy really is. Okay, so gets lost. So, where are we? This is such a pity because there's something here of much wider interest potentially needs to be brought out. I believe this can be done by taking a more concrete approach, and this is what I am going to do here. Well, this is for me difficult because back to the beginning. You see, I had this problem with beginnings always. And this book, I mean, I've been working on this for the last 10 years, since the millennium, and it's slow because it's... Anyway, never mind. But the problem is how you're going to begin. So I started off in one way, thought that's very good. I got to page 90 and decided I wasn't writing the book that I wanted to write. Didn't know what the book I wanted to write was, but I knew that this wasn't it. So that went in the drawer. I then got another way, which I thought was really terrific. I got to about page 120, and decided that this actually wasn't the book I wanted to write, and had got off in another direction altogether. Interesting that it was. So that went in the drawer. Anyway, I had several attempts at this. It just went in year after year. I simply could not begin this book. I knew it was this I wanted to do this work, but I couldn't get the beginning. So when I say at the beginning, beginnings are expensive. They're difficult. And if you get the beginning, you're halfway there. I really do mean that. I have a lot of experience of that. And eventually, I was so despair of the whole thing, and I don't remember any details, but I think somewhere or other I said to myself one day, when I just felt everything had reached rock bottom, and I couldn't do it, I said, well, how did I get into this in the first place? And I started to think about that. And I started to write that down. And then it started to work. And then I remembered something. I thought, that's it. That's the leitmotif for the whole thing. But it only happened when I did it that way. So then I wrote it a bit in that way. But this is very hard for me because it's very embarrassing. Because I'm an Englishman. And I was brought up in the 1950s. I mean, I was there in the 60s as well, in London. Wow. But I was really brought up in the 1950s. And an Englishman in the 1950s, one thing you know is you never talk about yourself. I'm, of course, completely out of touch with today's world. I mean, my wife looks at this thing called Facebook. I can't understand why she would do it. It's just I expect you do Facebook, don't you? Everybody does Facebook. I just not in tune at all with what's going on. So to write about myself, I actually also found quite painful the idea that I might publish this. I've just already used the word I am going to do this. I was told you never, under any circumstances, ever use the word I when you're writing. So I've used it. Oh my God, I've said I. You know, so this is a problem for me. So I'm reading this stuff. I'm talking about my background now, autobiographically. But I'm not, as they say in America, I'm not comfortable with it. Right, okay. But I'll have to do it because it seems to work. Oh God, it's not time for coffee. What time do we have coffee? Is it 11?
Can be.
What, you know, you're the expert, so you live here.
We're making it up as we go along.
Right, okay.
Each day changes.
Well, I'm going to break for coffee at 11 because I don't want you to get too bored. Okay, well, my introduction to European philosophy, really, apart from what happened in the 60s, came really through an unusual route. It didn't come through academic work. I'd been working, this is about end of the 60s, beginning of the 1970s, I'd been working with a small research group outside of universities completely, which was investigating more effective ways of communicating ideas in education. We had a thing we called structural communication, and we set up a charity, educational charity, called the Centre for Structural Communication. That was the late 60s, early 70s. At the same time, there was a growing interest in the UK in management education and organisational development, or OD, as it came to be called, because of course you mustn't mention anything by name today, you must always get letters for it. The kind of methods for more effective communication which we were developing, researching into, turned out to be of interest in management education as well. In fact, more so really, because in mainstream education there were so many institutional constraints, it was difficult to do anything which was really innovative. This was the time when systems theory, with a capital S and a capital T, was very much in vogue in the management world. It's got nothing to do with dynamical systems theory at all. It's the old-fashioned systems theory. Diagrams were very much in evidence. People were always drawing diagrams on flip charts, usually consisting of words in boxes. Then the boxes were linked up with other things by lines which were supposed to represent connections. The aim of systems thinking was to move away from the emphasis on the idea of basic building blocks towards the idea of the overall order of the organisational form. In the eyes of various theorists, it was believed this would lead to a general science of wholeness. And I heard it referred to as that. People would say, there is now a science of wholeness, it's systems theory. A general science of wholeness, which would be a universal science of organisation that would apply equally to all forms of organisation, irrespective of differences in kind. They could be physical, chemical, organic, ecological, psychological, sociological, cultural, historical. There would be a science of organisation which applied to all forms of organisation, form being taken in the sense of the organisation as a whole. It seemed to me that although the claim is made that systems thinking is holistic and therefore non-reductionistic, it is in fact much more reductionistic in practice than many of the optimistic pronouncements about it would lead us to suppose. First of all, I've used the word holistic, but nobody did use the word holistic in those days, back in 1970. The word holistic seems to me to have come in from California in connection with the work done on the bimodal brain, the two sides of the brain, tiles of the brain. That's really where, as far as I can see, the word holistic came from. Nobody ever used the word before the 1970s. The word holism had been used. It was introduced by Jan Smuts, who had been eventually president of South Africa and had a hand in sort of philosophical, biological things earlier on. And he introduced the word holism. It never caught on, except with various intellectuals like Arthur Koestler and so on and that. The notion of holism never caught on. It was felt to be a bit dippy. And with wholeness, the word wholeness, holistic was never used. It was wholeness in the 1960s, and I became a research student of David Bohm's in 1962, and the word that was used was wholeness. And that's similarly, whatever the word would be in German philosophy, I don't think it was ever actually really used. You see, and later on the word holistic came in, and through this brain research, nobody took much notice of it. Then it all got taken off in very silly ways, new agey ways, and all that sort of business, and there was a big reaction against it. But gradually the words come in, and often now we talk about holistic approaches in medicine. All it means is take more than one factor into account at once. That's all it means. In other words, it means comprehensive, which is a good thing, but it's hardly holistic. But the word does have its uses, and it is creeping in more. For example, it's now recognised, for example, that Heidegger's Being and Time, Book 1, Division 1, the whole description of the phenomenology of everydayness shows it to be completely holistic. Now people will use the word and say, well, Heidegger shows how this is a holistic, the being in the world is intrinsically holistic. And that is actually quite helpful, because it enables people to recognise that what's there, whereas they had it before but didn't quite see what it was. So it is useful. But basically at this time there was no such word. We just thought in terms of the notion of wholeness. That's how it was for me, that there was this wholeness factor. Later on, of course, the word holistic came in. This other business was with this systems theory, general systems theory. The man who was very much behind this, but I won't want to go into this in detail, was a man called von Bertalanffy, who wrote a book on this. You won't have heard of him. These people, they came from Vienna. They left Vienna because of Hitler, and they went to America. And these were the people associated with what became called the Vienna Circle, and this logical positivism, which had a very big impact in America, more than it did here. And then a lot of it came back here through behavioural psychology and so on and that, and various attitudes came back to Europe from America. But there were various people in this group who felt it was possible. I won't go into all that. Von Bertalanffy had this idea. A lot of people wanted to reduce everything to base. I'll tell you what the real impulse was. It was actually the work that had been done in mathematical logic. There was this great explosion of work in mathematical logic at the beginning of the 20th century. And this idea developed, it could be the foundation for everything. You could reform language by using methods of mathematical logic and make language precise. And these guys in the 1920s, they were very much concerned with what they saw as the misuse of language. And they had a good motivation. They felt that people were pulling the wool over people's eyes and getting away with all sorts of pseudoscience, which they included psychoanalysis and Marxism, which was always claimed to be a science of history and so on. In Europe it was. Not here, but in Europe. And they said, well, actually, if you could refine language properly, so you could make language really precise, then it would become evident to people that these things are not actually sciences at all. They were very concerned about this. They were very much concerned with social reform. And so this whole business was refining language through using the methods of mathematical logic. And that then spread to America, where it became a big thing. But quite often it involved reducing things as closely as you could to mathematics. And now the closest thing to mathematics was physics. So often it took that with Rudolf Carnot, who had a big influence in America, trying to reduce everything to physics and build everything up from there. And there's an awful lot was done on that. Now, von Bertalanffy had a different idea. He was actually a biologist, an embryologist, and he took a more organic approach to this. And this is what he had in the back of his mind. It wasn't a question of reducing everything to physics, but of finding this general systems approach in which you would find a theory of organizations which would occur at all different levels wherever you were. And that's what the idea was. And this way you would discover the wholeness. In fact, it looked to be terribly new, and people said that this overcame reductionism. But actually, if you go back and read Descartes, you'll find that he actually talks in words which are very, very similar in his rules for the direction of the mind. And we're going now, this is the first thing he wrote, but it was published after he was dead. So we're in late 1620s. And Descartes said, I came to see that the exclusive concern of mathematics is with questions of order and measure, and that it is irrelevant whether the measure in question involves numbers, shapes, stars, sounds, or any other object whatsoever. This made me realise there must be a general science which explains all the points that can be raised concerning order and measure, irrespective of the subject matter. And that science should be termed Mathematis Universalis, universal mathematics. Now, 300 years later, we've got von Bertalanffy saying, summarising this stuff, I don't want to waste your time with it, saying that general systems theory would deal with organised wholes as such. It would apply to all the sciences, physical, biological, psychological, sociological, and even to history. As he put it, the unity of science is granted not by a utopian reduction of all sciences to physics and chemistry, but by the structural uniformities of the different levels of reality. And if you actually compare what he says, the structural uniformities of the different levels of reality, that's the organisation which is the same throughout, is very similar to Descartes' general science of order and measure, irrespective of the subject matter. In fact, it's the same vision. So it's very interesting. I only discovered this many years later. And, I mean, everyone at the time said, oh, well, you see, what's happened with systems theory is that it's actually shown how to get away from the kind of analytical thinking where everything's broken down into bits and so on, was introduced by Descartes and others, and they were very keen on this. And in fact, unbeknown to him, he was pursuing exactly the same theme as was pursued by Descartes. So I think it's ironic here. There's an irony here, historical irony. And in fact, what Descartes was doing really was producing what would have been the first theory of everything. But he failed to do it, of course. And it can't be done. But I mean, he failed to do it. But that was his vision, because he had these dreams and these visions, you know. Actually, visions this time occurred to him in dreams. And in daytime, he got overheated, you know. And he had a vision, and an angel of truth appeared to him. And this business of this universal mathematics, which wasn't to do with number or anything, and that everything would follow from that. And this was an amazing thing. This is what really motivated Descartes. The bit of Descartes' work there is actually just small bits that were done. It was supposed to be a much more comprehensive thing, but of course he died. He actually thought that he was going to do the whole thing, because he thought he'd been specially chosen by God to do it. Well, that's okay. If you're chosen by God, you're going to get it done, aren't you? But what he didn't take into account the fact that he was going to get seduced into going to Sweden by this very persuasive queen who wanted him to teach her philosophy. It turned out at 4 o'clock in the morning, in the middle of the Swedish winter. So Descartes gets pneumonia and dies. I mean, you know, oh dear. So be careful about who seduces you into doing philosophy. Can be a dangerous thing from philosophy. Well, I think that what general systems theory is the same idea, and I'm not into Ken Wilber. I have to say that because I'm going to mention Ken Wilber. I'm not into Ken Wilber. I think there's more in him than some people think, and I think there's less in him than other people think. But his magnum opus, Sex, Ecology, Spirituality, has in it a brilliant treatment of systems theory, which I think is absolutely spot on. It comes round about page 100, so there we are. And he has an awareness of historical background as well. And I think one of our problems is this lack of comprehensiveness here, that we tend to look at things as they are at the moment. You know, Goethe used to say, and this is certainly true, that if you can't take 3,000 years into account in your thinking, then you're living from hand to mouth. And I think that's completely true. Because we think of history as something in the past. Actually, we're living in history. We're living here. That was there now, it's here now, we're living in it. And so it's the other side of the present, it's the missing body of the present, is the historical past. It's there, but we're not aware of it. So we misunderstand our own situation completely. And so just going back these few hundred years, we see the great claims that were made for general systems theory as the science of wholeness. It actually is a reductionistic system, very similar to Descartes, except people know Wilber's good on this. If you look at what a lot of these guys were doing, they were actually doing something holistic before there was holistic. And people think that what they were doing was reductionistic and so on, and it wasn't. And if you go into it carefully, you can see there's a holistic side to what they were doing, which nobody noticed. Because yes, they said you find the basic components and so on, and you put them together, reductionistic. But then they also had the idea that there were forms of order and measure which were the same in all levels of the universe. And that's a holistic picture, which comes out later in holistic thinking. But actually, it can become a form of holism. It can become a form of totalitarianism. And this is one of the problems with wholeness. It leads to nasty things. We'll mention that later, because that's one of the things in the paper I wrote, that very often people who are keen on wholeness go in for this kind of approach, and they end up becoming totalitarianists. There's a totalizing tendency. And that's when you get a counterfeit form. So one has to be very careful. So there we are. I've read that. I hope that makes some kind of sense. I'm garbling it away. So that is my background to this business. I had an allergic reaction to systems theory, big time, I became a thorough nuisance. I really pissed off everybody who knew me, everybody I was working with. When I look back now, I'm quite embarrassed actually. I wasn't nice to know. I was so so sure that this wasn't the right way to go. Funnily enough, I met someone a month ago I hadn't seen since 1974, who was a main person in this group, and I was very much at loggerheads with his approach. He was a very strong systems man. And I met him at the conference, and I knew I was going to, and I was dreading it. And, oh God, I met him. We got on like a house on fire. It was amazing, absolutely amazing. And he said to me, he said, over the years, I have come to realise that a lot of systems theory is utterly crass, and it's not at all what people think it is. I thought, bloody hell. Yeah, I said, yeah, I've also come to realise that there are approaches there which actually can be quite useful. So, the mellowing of age is a wonderful thing. Right, well, at that point, that's quite a good point. I'm going on. Unfortunately, you've got more to come. We'll stop. It's just about 11, and I'm off into something else then, which follows from that. So is it all right to stop now? I can go and take some stuff from me. Right, well, how long do you have for coffee?
15 minutes.
Oh, I can't cope in 15 minutes. 20. Because you've got to grate the coffee, haven't you?
Yeah.
And all that.
20 minutes seems like it.
I think 20 minutes is better, isn't it? Don't you? Yeah, I can't cope with 15. Because you've got to go downstairs and make it, and then wait for it, and fight for it.